So it is now 4 o'clock Central European time on September 30th. In the future, we are recording this lecture and Q&A 11 days ahead of time. And it is my huge pleasure to introduce Amelia Jones, whose talk is titled Curating Performance as Conservation, Thoughts on Queer Communion, Ron Athey. Amelia Jones is Robert Day Professor at Roski School of Art and Design, University of Southern California. Recent publications include the catalog Queer Communion, Ron Athey from 2020, co-edited with Andy Campbell. And this publication accompanies a retrospective of Athey's work, which she curated. And I believe this will be the topic also of today's talk by Amelia. She authored also In Between Subjects, a critical genealogy of queer performance in 2021. But we, of course, know her other seminal publication that had great impact on the field, among others, Seeing Differently, A History and Theory of Identification, and the Visual Arts from 2012, or Perform, Repeat, Record, Live Art in History from 2012, which she co-edited with Adrian Hetfield. And many other volumes, especially the last one, I think, was very important for our project and our thinking about the field. Her current work addresses the structural racism of the art world. So very briefly about her talk. Using the exhibition she curated in 2021, Queer Communion, Ron Athey, as an example, her talk will explore the question of how and whether to curate shows relating to live art practices in the gallery and museum setting. Can one curate performance art without reifying and ruining the energies of performance and the life? Is curatorial practice a place to experiment with alternative ways of historicizing live art? She argues through her exhibition that it potentially is. Rather than attempting to conserve performance by curating an artist's individual performances, she specifically sets out to explore how to honor the complexity of a life career of performance through the formation of queer communities in and around the artist Ron Athey. Amelia, huge pleasure to have you with us, and the screen is yours.
Thank you so much, all of you. I'm just thrilled to be here. It's an amazing topic that I've been thinking about for many years. So let me share my screen. Let's see. Great. So yeah, this talk seeks to do two things. I'm going to give an overview of the exhibition Queer Communion, Ron Athey, which was installed at Participant Inc. in New York and the ICA in LA in 2021. And really, there's an overarching series of questions. One of them is, what does it mean to curate live art? And of course, it has everything to do with that question of conservation and how performance exists through history, how we come to know about it. Queer Communion, I think most importantly, was not an exhibition of performance art. I thought about this a lot, and I did not want to give the impression that I was attempting to somehow, replace or represent individual performance pieces. Rather, I chose to mount an exhibition of a performance and creative life and career structured around community. And so I'll talk about why that's the case as I go through. So the other kind of bigger question for me was the issue of, a practice that is resolutely queer. It's known to be queer. It's known to, Ron Athey is known to be a queer BDSM performance artist. Everything about the way he's always been identified has been connected to that community and that set of issues. So how to maintain the energies of a queer subcultural life wherein the performances take place was really on my mind. How to maintain a queer politics and not, for example, reify or simplify a complicated career. Is curating then, can it be a form of conservation without reification, without freezing performances as if we can somehow recreate them in a gallery setting? How to keep the work alive. And for me, that meant keeping, again, not just individual performances, but this sense of a lived creative life, where performance is a way of, kind of publicly manifesting that and creating community. The historical and intellectual framework has always been very important to me, not to take the work away from the crucial kind of connection to very direct political and social histories of the moments when the performances were being done. So that's a tough thing of kind of keeping the tension between creating a space where participants coming into the show can experience it, but without simply just placing it in the present and forgetting about kind of what was going on at the time. And finally, to maintain a kind of living aesthetic and emotional experience that might in some way honor the aesthetic and emotional experience of being in the room with Ron Athey's live body performing. So again, not trying to congeal the work by somehow representing it in a final form, but rather like opening up the experiential side of performance through curating. So in this sense, I argue that, and I hope I manifested through the show, that curating can be a form of recalling performance, re-experiencing aspects of it, but not of correctly conserving or representing it. And I'll talk a lot more about that. Again, another question, how to frame a performance life so as to tell a story that provides the work with texture, historical framework, and so on, without instrumentalizing or putting the framework before the work, which, we all know that's like a big curatorial, but also art historical question that art historians can be very anxious about, is the idea of kind of imposing something on these innocent, otherwise, contextless artworks, which I've spent my life challenging that anyway. So, and again, how to provide a lively aesthetic experience without evacuating the difficulties and fierce politics of this particular work. This is not easy work. It's obviously, it's BDSM performance. So the worst thing would be to kind of anesthetize it by cleaning it all up and making it uncontroversial. So there's a lot I could say about trying to find venues for this show, which was extremely difficult because the vast majority of art world institutions don't want to take risks by putting work like this in a context where it's there over a period of time. So I did discover that there were lots of people who used me to get to Ron to commission individual performances, which it turns out are less threatening than actually putting like seriously challenging work in a curatorial space, which is a really interesting issue because it undermines the fantasy that somehow the live body is more threatening or more authentic than a curated show, because in some ways when it's there for a long period of time, it can be very threatening, even though the live body may not be there. And I wanted to take a little tangent, and this is coming out of like new work that I'm doing, but it was definitely informing the way I thought about this show, which is the deep history of curating in the Euro-American context, which is tied to Enlightenment logics of seeing, collecting, and knowing. and thus to the idea of correctly conserving or representing the things being arranged in the curatorial context. Curating itself, of course, has a very problematic history, and its singular goal in Europe has traditionally been to freeze objects in space and time, creating a trajectory that the visitor follows, often through a kind of curatorial logic of organization, and in the 20th century, very much through historical narratives that privilege objects made by white European men. So the organizational logic is there in the Cabinet of Curiosity and in the Natural History Museum, but it's in the Art Museum that it's orchestrated to privilege objects that are perceived as having been made by white European men. So, you know, conventional curating comes from a long history in Europe of collecting, organizing, and displaying objects, either those gathered or stolen through the violence of colonialism, which are considered artifacts, arranged as unauthored objects in cabinets or vitrines, or in the art museum, those made by, again, other Europeans, white men, which are considered high art. Western cities have been choreographed around this division. My favorite example, because it's so over the top, is Vienna, where you literally have identical buildings opposing each other across this vast lawn. One is for the things made by Black and brown people, the other is for the things made by white people. So high art works are given a status, obviously, that's the works by the colonized or not. And then, you know, then you roll into the history of the actual art museum, possibly beginning with the Louvre, but obviously there are a lot of things leading to this. And by the 19th century, you have a kind of congealing of that idea where it's kind of a social space, it's a space of seeing and knowing, and the things considered artworks are organized in a fashion that confirms a certain narrative and belief system. So what we see is two radically different yet mutually interrelated systems of cultural space, both of which freeze objects in space, but in completely different kind of modes and with completely different values. So within that tiny little sliver of a nutshell history, of course, you also have the display of bodies of the colonized others in a way that freezes them in place. You know, the famous examples are Franz Boas, the anthropologist, display of Native Americans, where you have literally mannequins that are dressed in their traditional dress. So they're kind of frozen in this past, not acknowledging their living presence, not acknowledging that, in fact, they are living, you know, at that time and today, and they do partake in modern life and so on. And then, you know, this is where you have these brilliant interventions by people such as artists such as James Luna of Lisueño, Digueño, North American tribal affiliation, who puts his live body in the anthropological museum, which amazingly enough is called the Museum of Man, and allows himself to be viewed by visitors who, of course, will be startled and shocked when they realize he's not a mannequin, he's actually a living body. So he's directly commenting on so many aspects of this situation, but relevant here is that he's challenging the idea that the body of the other is dead and in the past simply by being alive in that space. So it's a simple but very profound gesture. I don't want to dwell on this example, but this, of course, is the white artist from Europe who uses her live body deliberately reifying it as spectacle in the space of the museum. So in some ways, it's kind of the polar opposite of what Luna is trying to do. Abramovich seems to be trying to substantiate the value of the living body, but by freezing it in a space where it would normally be active and alive. So where are we then? Well, you mentioned the book that I co-edited with Adrian Heathfield. And this book is an extensive study of these debates around that were raging in the UK when I was living there around 2010, you know, maybe 5 years on either side. And this question of how to deal with, or what happens with time-based embodied performance or live art over time. How do we access it when it's finished? How does it get historicized? How does it get written about? I left Manchester, where I was living when I co-edited this book in 2010, and moved to Montreal. And around that time, I was starting to think about Ron Athey's work. He had also moved to England, and I was seeing a lot of his performances live. I had seen them previously in Los Angeles when I lived here in the 90s and early 2000s. And I started to think that his work provided kind of a unique challenge to this question of how to conserve or historicize or document or think about live art in history. So when I moved back to LA in 2014, and then Ron moved back here about a year later, and he then shortly thereafter received notice that his rent-controlled apartment of many, many years, which he had been subletting when he was abroad, classic case of late capitalist landlordism, as Jack Smith would call it, he found out he had to move. And in kind of the 21st century Western city, this is no small thing. It's generally a major crisis because rents are so high that it's really creating trauma and displacement for a lot of creative people. Long story short, he was so angry that he posted something, understandably, he posted something on Facebook about, I've had enough, you know, I'm throwing my archive out on the street, I'm gonna have a huge bonfire. And a number of his friends kind of frantically rallied, and my partner and I made a decision that we have a small house, but we have closets, and, you know, that we could offer to take the archive into our house. So I mention this because it is part of the lived experience of a creative career, when you not only want to curate a show that relates to the person's work, but you know the person and you yourself are living with the archive. So it's a kind of like multi-layered, very emotional situation. It's not a typical curatorial situation. So here's Ron in he had this big garage with literally like cardboard boxes and staples. There's a stationery company here, like these plastic bins where he just had piles of props. And inside his apartment, he had file cabinets filled with paper documentation, suitcases filled with photographs, some framed photographs, I mean, just masses of stuff. So we moved it over to our garage, and then, you know, that accelerated the process, both of helping him find a place that would take the archive, which ended up being the Getty, and of getting the show curated so that before the Getty took everything, at which point it can never be shown again because the Getty doesn't, you know, loan out entire collections. So this all happened in a very compressed and rapid way in 2017, where I had about 6 weeks before the Getty was going to come and pick up the first group of materials to pull out everything I thought might be in the show before I even had a venue. So it was a very stressful moment. So long story short, I pulled out a lot of materials, more than I actually ended up including in the show. I eventually got 2 venues. I got the Participant Inc. in New York City, run by Leah Gangitano, who is a hero, is the person who was willing to take a risk, who's long supported very complex and difficult queer work. And once I had that venue, then I got the ICA in Los Angeles. This is actually in Ron's old apartment. He had this giant chalkboard where he would write the things he needed to do. And my fantasy, of course, you can never actualize everything you want to do, but my fantasy was to have the timeline of the exhibition be this chalkboard and like write, you know, anyway, that didn't work. But you have these wonderful, if you know the artist and you can actually experience their creative space, that's another really interesting dimension to the idea of conserving performance, because it's a very different access than you would have if you just saw live performances. So again, repeating what I said at the beginning, it was not an exhibition of performance art per se. It was rather an exhibition of a performance, creative life, and career structured around community. So I can talk more about that issue of kind of why I chose community. I'm just gonna go quickly through that now so I can focus more on the documentation and the show and kind of what was happening there in terms of this question of performance conservation. I chose to put the main title of the show was Queer Communion, Ron Athey. I had to argue with some of the venue people about not doing the standard one-person show thing of putting the artist name first, because I really felt convinced, and I still feel this is the case, that honoring the life and the lived experience and the complexity of the people Ron has brought together through the work was a much more exciting way of honoring what it is he does than the kind of art historical monographic approach where you simply return to the author name all the time. And, you know, Ron has given many interviews, most, if not all of which I've read, of which are integrated into the catalog, where this idea of creating a bit of family is so much a part of the lived creative process that that's kind of what I was trying to honor with the show. And, you know, just showing the installation process at Participant gives you a sense of that family, and how, as the curator, in some ways, I was kind of deferring to all of his friends and colleagues who would come in and help him. And in fact, Ron played a key role in making the props actually look good, which I have no idea how to do. And so it was really a collaborative process curating the show, which kind of mirrored exactly the energies I was trying to express that I had seen with the community that he performs with. There we are, all exhausted. I think it was the night before the opening. The opening was COVID rules, but you can see on the left, Kembra Fowler. And, you know, this is what a Ron Athey opening is like, where the queer community is actually there. And it's like, I just felt the same in Los Angeles, where I felt like I'd achieved exactly what I'd hoped for, which was not only addressing that community through the show, but actually the community becomes a part of the show because they come to see it. So it's kind of a living thing. It's not a reifying, frozen in time, kind of, this is what the work is. I really tried to avoid that. Again, the idea of generosity, I could say more about that, but that's part of the idea of queer community. And the catalog, just in passing, is important to mention because for me, it's very much a part of the conservation, or the kind of how do you create, of course, the longer term document, since the show is no longer around, that gives access to a way of thinking about this person's performance art. So again, not a definitive document that gives you, you know, this is what the work is, but, and this gives a little bit of a sense of the prelude by myself and Andy Campbell, that we're establishing queer community and intimacy as an organizing logic of the life and career. And that the show really hopes to almost kind of create another or an extension of that organizing logic. So again, curating not as, oh, this is a definitive thing, but curating as, oh, let's extend what was already happening with this performance life. And these are the sections. I won't go into this now. I can come back if you're interested. The one I wanted to, again, the choice of how to organize the catalog, it's a very unorthodox, not a typical exhibition catalog. It doesn't even have a specific checklist, because as I was doing the book with Andy, we didn't even know necessarily what that would be. So it has kind of a general checklist. But my favorite part, which speaks to the theme of this conversation, is a section called Ron Athey Writings, that really seeks to use the form of the book to bring to life these, you know, selection from the thousands of sketches, diaries, correspondence, etc., from Ron's archive. So it was important to me that the sketches be reproduced in facsimile, and the wonderful Intellect Press was amazing. And there are hundreds of illustrations in the book, and some of them are these facsimiles directly from the archive. So that said, these are the sections of the show which were devised by me. As you can see, I give these rough dates, which were not on the wall of the show, but you're supposed to, as you go through the exhibition, get this sense of kind of a recursive chronology where, you know, religion and family continues to inform everything Ron does, but it kind of represents the earliest part of his life as he's developing these interests. He was raised by a fundamentalist Pentecostal family, and that's why religion is such a huge presence, and ritual in all of the aspects of his work. The music in clubs as he's becoming an adult, but still, of course, to this day, the literature, tattoo, BDSM, then the art, performance, politics, when he gets recognized by the art world as an artist, as performance artists, starting to be for the first time kind of acknowledged in the 90s. And then the last section is the new work and community. So again, this is part of trying to create an experience for visitors where they are kind of moving through a life without a strict chronology, because it keeps looping back through these themes as you go through. On the left, you see the participant version. It's a narrow alternative space type situation, which has its own queer energy because of the legacy of the exhibitions that Leah Gonditano has produced there. And then on the right, you see ICA, and here's a little bit more of ICA. So you can see, you know, one thing we could expand on a little bit is the vitrine, the choice of things to put in vitrines, and then some of the photographic documentation. This is from Ron in a very early kind of goth, raucous group that he was in with Roz Williams, performing when he was very young, like as a teenager. So certain photographs I chose to blow up and put on the wall. Certain photographs, gonna find an example. You can see here, you can see the early club scene on the left, and then on the right is when he started go-go dancing, dancing within queer clubs in LA when he's slightly older. And you can see around that big photograph, which is one of the kind of signature moments of the show, and it's a photograph by Sherry Rose, who herself worked with Bob Flanagan as a BDSM performance artist. Surrounding it are documentary elements that I chose to frame with the advice of Hannah Grossman, who was helping me out at the early part of the show, and arranging them and as a way to kind of dramatize again, recreate the energy of what it would have been like to be in that situation. Of course it's not, but instead of kind of pretending to make it into a singular work or moment, it's about, okay, this was a many nights of club dancing. You have the go-go boots and the cod piece, my single favorite prop in the whole show. And then you have all these flyers advertising nights that Ron was curating, but also nights in which his dancing or his increasingly art performance works were being featured. So again, it's about creating that drama, whereas the vitrines are more strictly kind of documentary materials, where you're looking at them in a more grungy kind of, yes, this is an archive. So I wanted to keep that tension between the beauty of some of the images, even though most of them were just ad hoc and taken by friends, and the kind of energy that you feel in those images, and then the more kind of informational presentation, even though some of those images are nice too. Yeah, so I'll just end, and then there's lots of points we could pick up, but I'll end with the final part, which is the new work and community, where his work Acephalous Monster is kind of evoked here with some of the props, the penis poles. That's a whole other story, but very dramatic. Like, I loved using the props, and Ron really encouraged this, like, as a way to dramatize and create theater around the work. And then this is kind of how that some of that same work looked at ICA. Didn't, it was a little bit antiseptic for me, but you use the space for what it can do. But at the ICA, I was able to include this group of portraits by friends of Ron Athey as the kind of last thing you saw before going into a screening room. So that was quite gratifying. So, I mean, in closing these main comments, I would just say this kind of quieter moment, this is like an art moment where you're actually standing in front of artworks. And I kind of loved at the ICA that I could orchestrate it that way, so that maybe even unconsciously you become aware of what happens with an artist and a lived career when they enter into history. You begin to access them through this kind of work where they become themselves subject of artworks. And so it is kind of a distant narration in a sense of that critique of what the art museum does, I guess. And I will, I'll just stop there and we can have a conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much,
Thank
Amelia.
you so much.
I was going to leave the slides on just in case your questions were relevant to that. Does that sound right?
Mm-hmm,
sure, that sounds great. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Amelia. I think, this is a continuation of our conversation from a few months ago, and I'm just just struck by how fresh and new to me many of this, despite the fact, you know, that I was familiar with your approach, many of your insights are. And perhaps, you know, it's a, if I may, I would just take the freedom to to ask the first question. And before we come to the conservation questions, which are so important, especially in our context, I will start perhaps from the end, just acknowledging actually also that, you know, there is an act of a beautiful, very telling act of care in you taking this archive to your home as well, you know, as a kind of station in the life of these artifacts, of the stories, of this narrative. And there is so much that could be said also on this, but I will start from the end, I noticed basically that, you know, there were no live events in this exhibition at all, right? You are clear about that the work is not, you're not presenting the work by Athey, but you are presenting his career, his trajectory, his community. And you elaborated on this community involvement and how the exhibition was also very much about people, you know, and I wonder how this exhibition actually became in a way a live event in itself, you know, a kind of gesture perhaps, like the means without an end, you know. I borrowed it from Agamben, and you know, there is quite a lot on this in Jose Munoz as well in his Cruising Utopia, a means without an end, something that is being kind of endured and supported rather than produced and acted. And at the end of the day, perhaps there is an afterlife to the exhibition as well. And I wonder whether you could talk also to this aspect of the afterlife of the exhibition, you know, in this kind of more rhizomatic, perhaps way of understanding what conservation can do with the work of the artist or with the career, then also what conservation can do with the exhibition itself.
Yeah, those are all amazing questions. So the live event question, I deliberately left the programming up to the institutions. And yes, I absolutely was focused on creating the show itself as an event, so that, and I wish I had thought to put some images from the opening at ICA, which was one of the first, we didn't wear masks. It was before whatever that variant was in summer of 2021. And it was like this exuberant kind of living circulation of both the queer community from LA from way back in the day to younger people kind of excited to enter the space and learn about this work. So yes, I considered that in itself like kind of what I was hoping to do. The programming, there was programming at both spaces actually. At ICA, fortuitously, Ron had negotiated with Red Cat, which is a theater not far in proximity actually to the ICA, and did performed Acephalous Monster. And when I was installing this part at the ICA, there was a bit of a moment where Ron and the gallery said, well, maybe you shouldn't install the Louis XVI wig or the penis poles because we're going to need them for the performance. I said, no, that's perfect. Like, they're living props. Ron constantly reuses things. So of course I was thrilled when they got borrowed and there was the little label on the wall saying these are being used in a live performance down the street. Because that was the point. They're not like dead objects that are representing something in the past. And that speaks to something very particular about how Ron works. He's constantly, both with people, kind of working with similar, you know, maybe slightly different groups of people that vary over time, but also with props that get reused and recycled and remade into something else. And I wanted that to be there. the afterlife of the show, for sure. I mean, the New York, actually, both of them got more reviews than I've ever gotten. I know it's because of Ron Athey. So lucky me, I got to ride on his star. And the reviews were amazing. I mean, like, I didn't always agree with every aspect of it, of course, but they, especially the ones in New York, I felt like they really got it. Like they really expressed the experience of being at the show, not so much in terms of me, but in terms of Ron. And that was, you know, that's kind of the ultimate goal of a curator, is not to be noticed, but for the experience to be exactly what you had hoped for. And then, so there's that, there's the reviews. And of course, I basically bought whatever magazines they were in, and they're in drawers right here waiting to be incorporated into the Getty archive, because I still have a bunch of Ron stuff in my house that I'm trying to get over the Getty. So that's like a living archive thing where I'm now, as the person trained as an art historian, I'm still accumulating things. And Ron was quite the accumulator as well. I mean, he has a really amazing archive. He hung on to a lot of things. But the catalog too, of course, the point of the catalog, I consider that like a curated thing. The catalog is very curated in the same, I mean, not identical way, of course, but it's curated in the sense that I thought a lot about, like, what can a book do that a show can't do? And how does the form of a book, you know, how can it speak to the career in a slightly different way? So that this is very much, for me, part of the afterlives or afterlife of the show. I mean, if it would be interesting, I could talk more about how that was organized, but up to you.
Can I ask something about I don't know, I was thinking about something related to what you were saying about the, you know, the props that you had in the show for Acephalous Monster that were then used, and how you thought that was a really good expression of the way that you wanted to present these objects, because it really struck me as you were speaking. Well, actually, a word occurred to me that often comes up in discussions of exhibitions of performance art or conceptual art, and that word is fetishization. And it occurs to me that that word has at least two meanings in this context. Because, so one thing I was thinking is that, you know, often there's this idea that we're trying to get away from fetishization, and we don't want to be too precious about objects that are not traditional works of art, but exactly are props or are in use or have a kind of rough materiality, and that they shouldn't just be treated as perfect aesthetic objects. But I was also thinking, when I was looking at, for example, you know, the photograph of the codpiece installed in a plexiglass box, that there's a reverse side to this, specifically with Athey's work, which is that you're also, and this is something you mentioned briefly, you know, you're also having to deal with the legacy of this artist not being taken seriously as an artist. And so you're presenting these objects that often don't receive that kind of high art treatment, and you're actually pushing them a little bit in the direction, I don't want to say of fetishization, but you're giving these kind of fetish objects a little bit of the kind of fetish quality that items get when they're displayed in an art context. And that in the case of this artist, isn't necessarily a destructive thing, but there's a kind of productive play between, okay, this is an item of clothing, this is just a prop, and also this is kind of a special aesthetic object that's sort of worthy of veneration. Then, of course, you know, there's the other sense of fetishization as kind of imbuing this kind of special sexual power into the things that we're seeing. And so I really appreciate the way that you're kind of balancing these sort of almost contradictory needs of these objects to allow these multiple lives and multiple aspects of them to come through in the show.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. You put it beautifully. I mean, they're absolutely fetishes, of course. I mean, he's literally a BDSM performance artist. Like, how could, and Ron definitely fully supported, you know, the theatrical presentation of these objects. Like, that's what his work does. It theatricalizes the body, it theatricalizes acts that certainly appear to the viewer to be, you know, giving someone pain. I mean, in that, you know, in Freudian terms, that's pretty directly related to fetishism.
I wanted to come back to the title of your exhibition was Queer Communion, and then you mentioned that you wanted to practice queer curating. So I was wondering, what could it be to perform queer conservation or queer preservation, if that's even a possibility?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I guess I'm trying to offer one way you would think about that would be through curatorial, but also the catalog, which conserves in this kind of deliberately piecemeal way. So the catalog, in a longer version of this show, I talk about Dominic Johnson's art history book called Pleading in the Blood, which is also about Ron Athey. And I deliberately went to the same press. And it's designed to look like a companion to that book, because Dominic did all the art historical work. And I'm not saying it's not queer, but it's fairly like, because that's the work that needed to be done earlier in the 2000s, was the book that made the images look like artworks, you know, and the book that kind of did focus much more on individual performances in an art historical way. So that freed us to do what, to my mind, might have been a queer enterprise of being much looser. We didn't feel obligated to trace the things that Dominic had already done for us. You know, it was an amazing gift that Dominic had done that work. And so that whole, like the whole way we organized that, and I'm saying this as an answer to your question, like, it's the way that you frame the project. Like, if we had framed the show, if I had framed the show, or if we had framed the book as a chronological documentation of Ron Athey's performance artwork, even Dominic moves away from that. Dominic's a very queer thinker in other ways. So it's about, like, okay, how can we honor this in a way that keeps the energies of queer community constantly circulating? And so we talked about the object lessons were one way of doing that, to get people to think materially with these, you know, things that come out of these extremely queer spaces. What does that mean when they stop being part of those spaces, at least momentarily? How do you keep that energy alive in relation to them? You know, those are questions that I think are the same for any kind of performance archival project. An archive, though, by definition, is the ultimate example of being rationalized through Enlightenment ideas of, you know, making sense of chaos, right? Like, the same way curating, in a way, like, as I said in the beginning, is like the whole point is to reify things, to make them visible for a narrative. So you have to work with the awareness that that's what the archive needs to do, or what it will automatically do, and find ways to complicate that. I mean, I know that, I'm sure you all have had this experience, the rare chance, if you do get to see materials before they get processed by an archive, it's so much more interesting. Because, I mean, in my case, I was lucky enough to be at Ron's house while he was putting things in those plastic bins. And I mean, I joke because a couple of times he would take like stuff on his desktop and just kind of scrape it into the, I mean, there's no logic whatsoever, except that it just all happened to be sitting there. But the Getty archivists are going to be like, oh, these need to be organized. And then every person in the future who looks at that archive is going to assume that somehow that organization relates to Ron's life and the way he organizes life. And again, I would go back to that chalkboard where being someone's friend and being a little more inside how they do things is an incredible gift when you're thinking about these things.
Amelia, thank you so much. It was really so wonderful to converse with you. Thank you so much for your lecture and generosity in sharing your knowledge with us. I'm speaking here obviously on behalf of my colleagues, but also of everyone watching that will be watching us or watching the recording during our colloquium.